We get started? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first in a series of talks sponsored by the Utah Criminal Justice Center and the College of Social Work at the University of Utah. I'm Dr. Emily Salisbury, the new director of the Utah Criminal Justice Center, and I'm thrilled to be able to facilitate this conversation among our very esteemed speakers today. I'm grateful to be a part of a university that's not afraid to have challenging conversations about controversial topics, particularly around the issue of police violence, race, and community healing. A word about the Utah Criminal Justice Center. We're a collaborative partnership between the University of Utah's College of Social Work, the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and the College of Social and Behavioral Science. The UCJC also has a long-standing partnership with the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice that supports interdisciplinary research, teaching, and training. Our center works towards reducing crime and victimization, inspiring sound public policy and fair treatment, and providing a model of higher education that promotes good governance through independent, nonpartisan research and innovative programs. Our primary goal in these talks is to create a constructive community dialogue among local law enforcement and public service leaders, informed by the research of nationally recognized scholars. Today, that scholar is Dr. Jennifer Kobina from Michigan State University. With these events, we're also inviting the community to reject apathy and complacency and to dare to care about these issues, no matter what your perspective is. After all, if we can't facilitate open-minded dialogue with an eye toward viewpoint diversity on a college campus, then I'm not really sure where we can. And while we certainly are not going to solve such painful problems in our time today, we hope to provide a more sophisticated, evidence-based dialogue about these topics compared to what we're generally seeing elsewhere. These are highly complex issues, so complex that I'd be surprised if we all agreed on the solutions or even what exactly the problems are. But just as we ask our students to enter our classrooms with an open mind, we're asking that the audience members do the same. As a trained criminologist, I'd like to share just a few hard facts before we get started. Upwards of 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record, and this is not evenly distributed across race, gender, or socioeconomic status. Our country is fascinated, indeed even obsessed with punishment. We've binged ourselves on mass incarceration, and we cannot deny that this obsession is disproportionately targeted toward marginalized and minoritized people. At every entry point in the juvenile and criminal legal systems, Black and brown people are disproportionately trailed, nailed, and jailed, despite not engaging in any more crime or substance use than white people. So I'm heartened by the fact that people, perhaps now more than ever, want to engage in protest and activate their lives towards social change. As we move forward as a community, it's my hope that the Utah Criminal Justice Center will be called upon to be part of the solution. This is not easy or comfortable work, which is precisely why it needs to be tackled. I feel that the center is in a unique position to significantly contribute to evaluating possible solutions, given the strength of our board and our staff. As we get started, I do want to point out the audience the Q&A and chat functions that are available to you. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please submit it to the QA function, and we'll do our best to answer it. If you have a general comment or resource you'd like to share or point others to, please use the chat function for that purpose. And with all this in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our esteemed speakers today. First, Dr. Jennifer Kobina is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. She received her PhD in criminal justice at the University of Missouri-St. Louis in 2009. Dr. Kobina's expertise centers on police-community relations, youth violence, and concentrated neighborhood disadvantage, with a particular focus on the experiences of minority youth and the impact of race, class, and gender on criminal justice practices. Her research also focuses on corrections, prisoner reentry, and the understanding of recidivism and desistance from crime. Dr. Kobina is the author of the recently published book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot: Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. For her book, she conducted nearly 200 interviews with protesters and residents of Ferguson and Baltimore following the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray in 2014 and 2015. Her book investigates how and why both Ferguson and Baltimore became highly publicized sites for protests against racially biased policing and broader structural inequalities. Specifically, her book examines how Ferguson and Baltimore residents understand their experiences with the police, the impact that those experiences have on their perceptions of police, and what galvanized Black Lives Matter as a social movement. Given her expertise and scholarship, I'm sure you can understand why we've asked Dr. Kobina to educate us today in this conversation. And turning to our local leaders, Marlon Lynch is the inaugural Chief Safety Officer at the University of Utah. As the CSO, he provides leadership, development, coordination, and direction for all aspects of campus safety at the U, promoting a safe, secure, and service-oriented environment for all members of the university community. His progression in his career includes 27 years of public safety experience in the municipal, campus, and healthcare environments. Chief Lynch has many accolades and has served on multiple national and international law enforcement governing bodies. He's clearly a decorated public safety administrator, and we're very fortunate to have his expertise at the U. Jessica Waters is the social work director for the Community Connections team at the Salt Lake City Police Department. The team pairs social workers directly with law enforcement to respond and collaborate on emergency calls for service related to various community social needs, such as mental health, substance use, and homelessness. While earning her MSW in forensics at the U, she interned at the Salt Lake County Jail as a therapist and with the Salt Lake Legal Defender's Office before transitioning to her career at the Salt Lake City Police Department. She first began there as a therapist and quickly moved to the director role. She has a rich professional experience serving diverse populations, and we're very pleased to have Director Waters return to us today at the U. Welcome back. And finally, Jojo Liu is the director of the Salt Lake County Office of Criminal Justice Initiatives and has been the director of the Salt Lake County Criminal Justice Advisory Council since January of this year. She's trained as an attorney and began her legal career defending young people charged in the juvenile justice system. Director Liu was also a clinical law professor for over a decade, focusing on juvenile and criminal justice issues. Between 2017 and 2019, she was the assistant director of the Utah Indigent Defense Commission, where she worked on ensuring that all court-involved youth in Utah are provided legal representation in court. So we're very fortunate to have each of you with us today. At this time, I'd like to turn the session over to Dr. Kobina to give us a discussion on her scholarship and to the social movements happening today around Black Lives Matter and policing. I've asked Dr. Kobina to spend about 15 minutes presenting, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the speakers for discussion. Thanks.
All right. I want to thank Dr. Salisbury for inviting me to speak at the Utah Criminal Justice Center Dare to Care event. I think it's an incredibly important issue for us to be discussing. I also want to thank all of the panelists who are part of this webinar. And finally, I'm grateful to all of those who are in attendance. I'm aware that there's a large number of you all who are part of this webinar, so thank you. Acts of injustice against Black people, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Christian Cooper, and countless others, these are all recent examples of the state violence Black people have encountered in the United States. George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American male, was murdered because a Minneapolis police officer pressed his knee into his neck for nearly 9 minutes, while 3 other officers did nothing to stop it as Floyd begged for his life and pleaded for his mother. Amid COVID-19, George Floyd's killing has sparked sustained protests across the country and around the world as millions have taken to the streets to protest systemic racism, police violence, and broader structural inequalities. We have seen cities set on fire with the anguish, the pain, and deep sorrow that's wrought by the violence visited on the bodies of Black people. But at the same time, we know that violence, protests, and demonstrations, these are not new. In many ways, the massive demonstrations that are taking place, they resemble protests that took place in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, following both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's deaths in 2014 and 2015, respectively. The deaths of both young men gave rise to the Black Lives Matters movement, which emerged in 2013 after the murder-acquittal of George Zimmerman and the death of Trayvon Martin, who at the time was a 17-year-old African-American boy. So because many African Americans, they were tired of the extrajudicial killings of Blacks by police and self-declared vigilantes, this movement really unfolded as a call for action, demanding changes with how police deal with racial ethnic minorities and calling for an end to systemic racism that exists in this country. The deaths of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray, they were two of several high-profile police killings that gave impetus to the Black Lives Matters movement. And protests at each of these sites brought out decades of pent-up emotions of anger, outrage, and frustration from much of the Black community. The use of repressive police tactics against protesters at each of these locations also confirmed to many the continued racism and discrimination that Blacks experience and still continue to experience at the hands of various state institutions, including law enforcement. The city of Ferguson was a flashpoint for nationwide protests since the killing of Michael Brown, who was at the time an unarmed African-American man and fatally killed by a white police officer from the Ferguson Police Department. 2 to 3 months following both young men's death, both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's death, I conducted nearly 200 interviews with protesters and residents of both of these cities. Large amounts of people took to the streets because they believed that Michael Brown and Freddie Gray were victims of injustice and that these were not isolated incidents. And they believe that either they themselves had personally been victims of police harassment, surveillance, and violence, or they knew family members, friends, neighbors, or colleagues who were the recipients of such acts by law enforcement. Protesters explicitly tied their involvement in protests to these broader patterns of criminalization that have led to heightened police scrutiny. In addition, many felt an overwhelming obligation to demonstrate, as they understood that failure to do so would result in more Black people dying at the hands of the police. And so as a result, approximately 2/3 of the people I spoke with who protested back then, they were protesting for the first time. And among the activists that I interviewed, the desire to achieve change and put an end to police violence and systemic racism, these were central factors that actually led them to actually participate in various protests. However, it was not uncommon for protesters on the front lines to become recipients of repressive or aggressive military police tactics. Though thousands of people took to the streets to protest treatment by the state, the government sent more police with high-powered weapons and military tanks. Like what we've seen over the last several weeks, tactics that law enforcement was using to manage protests, such as the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, physical force, large-scale arrests, these were also deployed on demonstrators. Those who protested on the front lines and who were more vocal about denouncing police brutality and challenged the authority of law enforcement, they were much more likely to experience as well as witness repressive police actions. Similar to the unrest taking place now, in the midst of protesters decrying the killing of Black people by law enforcement, we see that they continued to also experience heavy-handed military tactics that were being used on them by law enforcement. And despite having experienced state-sanctioned violence, those who remained committed to the movement were insistent on remaining active in subsequent protests in order to bring about change. However, I will admit that there were also some who were deterred from engaging in subsequent street protests because of the coercive ways in which authorities policed the protests. Yet even amid all that, though some were discouraged from continuing to engage in street protests, many adapted different ways to continue to stay motivated and engage in the overall ideological goals of the Black Lives Matters movement. For instance, there were some who organized and strategized behind the scenes. Others became grassroots organizers. There were some who became much more civically engaged, and others became social justice advocates. And so ultimately, the more repressive the police were, the more some protesters developed resistance and became more civically engaged in an effort to root out systemic racism and put an end to police violence that continues to rob many Black people of their lives. However, ending police violence of Black people will not take place by continuously investing in the police department. We know that this nation was founded on a system of slavery. What many people are not aware of is that the origins of policing in the United States can be tied to the institution of slavery. Slave patrols were among the first state-sponsored police force that controlled the slave population. And to defend their slave property interests, slave codes were established, which were essentially state laws that defined the status of slaves and their owners, giving absolute power to the owners to govern their slaves as chattel or as property. Even when slavery was abolished, states relied on the legal system and the prison system to create policies in order to maintain racial subordination. For instance, Black codes were established, which created new offenses for certain types of behaviors, such as loitering and vagrancy. Anyone found in violation would be punishable by fines, imprisonment, and forced labor for up to 1 year. These laws, however, were discriminatory in nature because they were applied selectively to African Americans in an attempt to restrict their movements and restrict their freedom and force them to work based on cheap labor or debt. Even when Black codes were overturned, Southern states pursued racial segregation in an attempt to ensure white supremacy. This is what led to the proliferation of Jim Crow, which referred to the various state laws that established different rules for Blacks and whites. So it ultimately regulated the nature of interracial social contact. And we continue to see such acts of racial subordination taking place via mass incarceration, where a disproportionate number of Black and brown people are incarcerated. So ultimately, we see that from slave patrols to slave codes to Black codes to Jim Crow, and even now with mass incarceration, racially biased legislation has been enforced for several centuries. And this is important to bring up because the structural legacy of slavery and Jim Crow continues to shape Black people's position in society and influence how they are treated by individuals and institutions, including the criminal legal system. We all bore witness to George Floyd's death. His killing, along with countless number of Black and brown people who have died at the hands of the police, are hardly outliers. Rather, they are examples of racial hostility, racial bias, legalized racial subordination, and a normative police practice that targets Black individuals. And the issue of racially motivated killings is not just simply a product of individual discriminatory police officers, but rather it's a result of deep historical forces that follow a pattern of social control over Black people that's really entwined in the very fabric of the United States. Insufficient attention has been paid to the poisonous legacy of racism that infects not only Ferguson, not only Baltimore, and not only Milwaukee, but we know that it infects communities nationwide and is quite visible within America's criminal legal system. This nation has been fittingly termed the United States of amnesia, owing to its failure to confront and repair the damage created by America's history of racial injustice. Yet, as novelist Toni Morrison noted in her 1993 essay, that it was on the backs of Blacks that America was built. That is, this nation was founded on a system of slavery. However, it has yet to own up to the ways in which racial bias and legalized racial subordination have compromised our ability to implement criminal justice. America's racialized past influences the way that others perceive Black people, including their treatment by the criminal legal system, which is also inclusive of law enforcement. Without attention to this history, any attempts to try to control crime and improve police-civilian relationships will be mediocre at best or fail at worst. And in the wake of ignoring or diminishing America's history and legacy of legally sanctioned racial subordination, cities across the nation are now bearing witness to this unacknowledged continuity between past and present. America's long history of state-sanctioned violence against Black Americans reflect persistent inequities within the criminal legal system. The Movement for Black Lives and many other activists and organizations have called for reinvestments of federal dollars to education, employment, and social services in Black communities, which have been shown to improve community safety. The idea behind defunding the police is really that there should be massive restructuring of public spending priorities. Specifically, it calls for reductions to existing policing and carceral infrastructure. The United States collectively spends $100 billion a year on policing and a further $80 billion on incarceration. And you did not mishear me. That is $100 billion on policing each year and $80 billion on incarceration each year. And currently, the way that our government deals with poor inner cities, poor racial ethnic neighborhoods is by investing in the police and criminal legal system, and yet under-investing in social programs or economic opportunities. In the United States, we rely on the police to solve a plethora of social problems, from abuse to abandonment to homelessness to domestic disputes, school disruptions, unemployment, and we rely on the state to deal with these issues instead of social workers, therapists, educators, and medical workers. And so calls to defund the police entails divesting in police and prison expansion and investing instead in resources that create safety for Black people and people of color, which would mean investing in high quality public schools, investing in clean and affordable housing, investing in mental health care, the creation of living wage jobs with healthcare and benefits, investing in youth development services and social programs. And so investing in human-centered services would help to stabilize communities. Rather than continuing to feed a culture of control, we must advocate for creating a culture of care where individuals, especially Black and brown people who reside in marginalized communities, are nurtured so that they can thrive. And so cries to defund the police is really about investing in social policies that prevent people from experiencing violence and harm in the first place. And so that is the way that we transform and claim a healthy, safe future for our children, for elderly individuals, and for all of us as human beings. Ending the killing of Black people requires doubling down on investments in communities, not the police or the criminal legal system. Redistributing resources from the criminal legal system into cultivating institutions within poor communities is vital. When we break these structural systems of oppression and seek an alternative vision for safety that takes power away from the hands of the police and puts it into communities, only then will we begin to put an end to denying many marginalized people their humanity. Thank you.
Dr. Kobina, thank you so much. It was just incredibly rich with knowledge and expertise. Appreciate it. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to kind of ponder, and I have quite a bit of things I would like to say, but I want to turn it over to our panelists, of course. And I wonder if we might start with Chief Lynch. Again, if you would just remind us all of your role at the U and introduce us again to your expertise, and give us maybe some of your thoughts and comments and reactions and what we're doing certainly at the U around many of these issues. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Salisbury. Dr. Cobbina, definitely appreciate your comments today and the work that you have conducted, specifically with Ferguson and the Baltimore effect and the residual, and even covering the history on that. So definitely appreciate your comments. My background in itself, I started out as a municipal police officer and then transitioned into university policing. So 5 years working for a city police department, and the remaining time has been in higher ed, primarily in metropolitan areas like New York and Chicago, and now here in Salt Lake City with that. But what is also very relevant is, you can see, is I'm a Black man, and I grew up in Chicago. And the history of the Chicago Police Department is very well known in regards to that. And I'm also a father of 2 teenage boys who are very active, and we have constant conversations in regards to how they interact with the police with that. And that's just part of it. My career in itself has afforded me the opportunity to be both Black and in law enforcement, which at times can tend to be contradictory, which at times can cause you to be questioned by even the people that you grew up with, as well as relatives. And at the same time, being part of law enforcement and trying to find your way between the two and the cultures and things like that. And for me, I've known for a very long time what I wanted to do in my career and my profession. And it's what I majored in undergrad and graduate school and prepared myself for it. And my decision was primarily made on being able to have an impact on what change needs to be made from the inside, so to speak, with that. And those battles are fought on a daily basis in regards to it. With the overall experience in working, in metropolitan areas and then coming into higher education, they present different challenges. As we know, what generally happens on a college campus is reflective of what's happening in the community itself with that. And our populations are definitely impacted by that as well. Just the background of my role here at the University of Utah is I have institutional responsibility for all the safety and security functions. And what that means is that the police chief, the university police chief reports to me, our director of security for U Health security, our campus security, meaning the unarmed, non-sworn security staff that are on campus, and emergency management. I was brought here after a pretty significant incident that occurred in 2018. Actually, that was one of several over time. With that was to completely rebuild the function here. And so, in listening to Dr. Kobina speak and in just the commentary in regards of a lot of the protests and demonstration since the killing of George Floyd is about reestablishing trust and rebuilding the function itself. And I actually have the opportunity to rebuild the function here, and that's what we're doing with it. I've had a lot of discussion regarding what defund means. And the abolish police and things like that. I'm going to be biased and say that I think that there is a need for some level of policing. And I think most people would say that there needs to be some level, but it needs to be a level that is agreed upon and appropriate for the communities that you serve. The defunding component is how are we defining it? And I've looked at it as a reallocation of funds for it. And I'll say, for example, the functions here at the University of Utah, all of the public safety functions reported up through the police department. Everything went to the police chief and it was part of the police department. I announced the reorganization at the beginning of July that flattened that organizational structure and removed all of the other functions from the police department to allow them to have it's a reporting line, but more importantly is to separate the functions to identify, it's a role identification. So the police department will provide police services and they will have a level of community engagement. However, the requirements and the focus of a university police department are going to be different than a security department with that, as well as the emergency management. But I created a new division called Community Services. And what the Community Services division is it will be a source for victim services. We had a victim advocate that worked with the police department. They will still have a victim advocate, but what the victim services will be for all victims of crime, not just those that are victims of interpersonal violence or sexual violence, but anyone who has been victimized, they will receive services. It is also our resource for the behavioral intervention team for the university. But we are also just entered into a partnership with the College of Social Work to establish internships for graduate and undergraduate students to work alongside or instead of a police response. What we have found is our data shows that it's almost a 50-50 split in regards to the calls for service that are received to the university police department. about half of them are not police oriented. And in my 27 years, I've experienced a lot of the transition of responsibilities to police. There were comments earlier about the police are used to solve everything, or not everything, that's an exaggeration, a lot of the situations. And it's primarily based on the fact that police services are available 24/7, 365 days of the year. Most of the other services are generally Monday through Friday in traditional business hours. And as we know, the calls for service come at all times of the day and night. And so initially, most of the police training in regards to mental health issues and mental health crisis, dealing with the homeless, or traditional social work functions, the police receive initially the training to assess and then refer to a service. That has progressed over time to assess, try to handle, maybe you can do it, maybe you can't, and then you go back to what you know and what you've been trained as a police officer with it. Not pointing blame or anything like that. That's how things have developed and evolved. And a lot of it is due to the availability of a response, but then also there had been reduction of services in other areas for some of those social work functions. And, you know, I sort of chuckled to myself when I heard Dr. Cobbina mention, you know, responding to incident, you know, sort of civil disputes and different things like that. You call police. You know, someone is truant from school, you call the police. There's a homeless person, you call the police. Those are not necessarily services that the police are actually trained for. And I've had different discussions regarding, well, why can't they handle it and things like that? Well, why do we actually have professionals who do this as a career? It's because it takes a level of training and education and experiences to be able to provide the appropriate type of services. Now, there are some police officers who are very adept at handling these types of situations. We just had one of our police officers, excuse me, just completed the master's in social work program here at the U. And he's a great asset in handling the various situations here, but he's one of how many, right? And he's not available to respond to all of the calls with this. And so our efforts here are to engage our community, to allow them to determine how the public safety services will be delivered to them. So for example, and that'll be through committee work, Public Safety Advisory Committee that will meet twice a month with myself and my leadership team to talk about the new initiatives, how they can be implemented, what are the possible impact and consequences of these types of actions, and have those discussions prior to the implementation of different initiatives so that we have, one, our community has direct impact and input, but then they can also share how this initiative came about and what the intent is. Sometimes we tend in public safety is to, I won't necessarily say assume, but identify a trend and try to fix it internally without necessarily going to members of the community, those who are going to be impacted or those with the skill set to actually provide the insight that will lead to a successful and sustainable program, as opposed to what I call a Band-Aid. You know, something that's going to be a quick fix, something that you can just apply. But what happens with that? At some point, the Band-Aid comes off. and there may be the issue is still there. So we're looking for a more engaged approach, but also an approach that is informed by our community. Some of the systemic issues with that is that, you know, a police academy, and I'll just sort of speak broadly and generally, usually takes anywhere from 4 to 6 months to complete. And that's a full-time job. Most Black and brown members or people in our communities cannot afford to quit a job for 4 to 6 months if you are not already employed while you're going through the academy. So the tendency is to hire those who already have the certifications, which tends to be, you know, not the underrepresented communities with that. And so we're starting an initiative to where we will hire and will actually pay for academy attendance and provide salary during that time frame so that we can increase our diversity. Both that diversity being race and gender. because what we find as well, as far as women in law enforcement, again, you tend not to be able to quit for 4 to 6 months, whether it's childcare or other reasons and things like that. But trying to find ways to infuse our applicant pool with more diversity, so then we would be able to hire more diverse staff with that. The other components to that will be through initiatives. We're fortunate enough to be, at a college campus to where we can utilize internships. And most of the diversity that you will find, although it's not extremely diverse, but a lot of the diversity in Salt Lake City or in Utah resides here on campus. And so as we can expose our students to what we actually do by working side by side, that will increase our ability to be more diverse as well. So our task is tall here in general, and the national narrative definitely impacts us as well. But I think some part of my contribution to this discussion is the fact that we have an opportunity to rebuild, and we are utilizing what is being said and demanded to inform what our structure and how our practices will proceed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chief Lynch. I'm, of course, very pleased to hear the news about the relationship and the partnership with the College of Social Work and to allow internships to occur, certainly for our students. That what a rich, sort of opportunity. And I don't see that sort of mobilized enough on college campuses. Having served in multiple criminal justice departments, I'm always kind of astonished that we don't always have relationships with our campus safety and campus police on university campuses. So that's very good news. I wonder if we might turn it over to Director Waters from the Salt Lake City Police Department. I know we've got a number of questions that are popping up, but I'd like to be able to allow all speakers to kind of react to Dr. Kobina's research first, and to, again, share with us your expertise and what things are going on in your agencies. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you, Chief Lynch, for that too. I think there's a lot of information that I was nodding my head to. I play a unique role as a social worker for the Salt Lake City Police Department. 1, that I'm white, 2, that I'm female, and 3, that I'm a civilian. Our program is still a newer model where we have social workers embedded in the police department. A lot of different agencies will contract out with mental health providers, but with ours, we have the privilege of being within the police department. And so I've been there for 4 years now. It's been very interesting to see. I've been really surprised at what all officers are faced with. One thing that really surprised me is just how much social work stuff officers do day in and day out, or how many social issues they focus on. And I think Dr. Cobbina, you touched on that too, that unfortunately funds have been pulled from different areas, and therefore officers are responding to homeless calls or mental health calls, or there's underfunding with housing and mental health. That I have been so amazed since starting there of how many calls we respond to, since we respond to 911 calls that we would deem social issues, whether that is substance use, mental health, homelessness. And so this is all throughout Salt Lake City. In general, we serve the entire city. And what's been amazing to me is just how much is focused on social issues and not necessarily like what I would call a police issue, whether that is immediate violence or an issue that needs intervention immediately. A lot of times it is a homeless camp or someone having a mental health crisis, and there aren't other services, or other services are only, like you mentioned, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. And we know crisis and life happens 24/7. And so I think it's been interesting too, being a social worker and in the police department, in this discussion about defunding police. And I know, Dr. Cobbina, you talked about, what was the term, the blue, it's a blue thing in your book. Is that right? Yeah. And just kind of the culture about policing, and the police department becomes a family, of a way to protect one another. And then also, what part does that play in establishing our views on racism or policing in general? And I thought that was pretty interesting, because even as a civilian, I have felt like I became a part of a family. And I feel like that family is formed because of trauma and because of so much that the officers see that I never thought they saw until I got into this, or you hear about it, but when you see it, then it's pretty amazing to see, whoa, like how are police seeing this all the time? And so even for me, my initial reactions with defunding the police, I get pulled in multiple directions too, emotionally and, just like professionally, just thinking, what does that mean for the officers I work with day in and day out? What does it mean for the community? How can we support both sides? Because I know a lot of officers I work with, we have detectives on our team that we respond with all the time. And I know they have the same frustrations with, like, why isn't there affordable housing? Like, if only we could get this person housed, it wouldn't have to be us to come out on him all the time. Or it's not necessarily for me as a police officer to be out on this. And I know officers can relate with those frustrations and feel like it's unfortunate that people aren't getting all the same care, same services. And I think that's an area that people haven't necessarily recognized as much, that officers feel frustrations too of how the system has failed day in and day out, and they work in it. Luckily for me, I'm not an officer, so I'm pulled in a different way than what an officer would be, I would imagine. But I think it's interesting because, yeah, with defunding the police, I do think there needs to be more focus on social areas, whether that is mental health, affordable housing, medical care, even Medicaid expansion recently happening in Utah, and we didn't have that before. And I also think that our police department still does, need funding. It's not the idea that funding's getting taken away, but I think we need more funding in areas of training. Officers go through a 40-hour academy here with Salt Lake for CIT, crisis intervention, and that's how do we deal with mental health crisis, and that's only 40 hours, and a good chunk of their job is more than that every week. So I think there should be more funding in the police end for education and scholarly education, not just like a webinar, but personal experiences too. And I think it would be interesting to see officers, because of the community feeling, the family feeling with police. It's a blue thing, like you mentioned in the book, that I think it takes for them, they appreciate hearing other people's insight when they can also feel that someone's experienced what they have. And I think, Chief Lynch, you've been able to be on the front lines and see what's going on, and also be a part of the change higher up too. And I think that says a lot when you've been on those front lines and experienced it, and be able to see areas that you can change in. And so, yeah, I'm constantly polling, constantly reflecting of what does that mean? What does it mean for me as a white person working for the police department, as a civilian, and where can I help change at? And so in our program, we try and do education with our own team. And I can't speak on behalf of the entire police department, but they are, I'm sure some of you guys have heard in the news, they're looking for more areas of education, and they're going to have a board who reviews stuff for racial equity. And so I think those are little steps. Those are only baby steps. This is a bigger systematic issue that goes years behind us, centuries behind us. And so I think it's important to note the history, and also reflecting on that and not getting stagnant in how we feel, and forgetting about the past and how that impacts us today. And so with that, I think we still need more steps forward, and it is challenging to see, but with our program, we're trying to challenge each other just personally on what does that mean if we go out on a call, or even if someone calls 911 about a call and you hear the description, it's like, is that a valid call? Like, where is this coming from? What is the motivation of the person calling? Is it because someone looks dirty in the park? Or is it because there's a true issue happening right now? And so checking on those biases and understanding where we fall personally and how that impacts policing. So yeah, I think it's a great discussion. This is always challenging, but we need to have these talks, and because it's happening day in and day out. And I think that's really all I have right now. Yeah, but thank you for the book and the information as well. It's been very insightful.
Thank you so much, Director Waters. It's important points that you've made, and I'm learning quite a bit, and learning a lot, certainly too, in my new time here in Salt Lake City, and thinking about what partnerships are being created, and just think it's incredibly innovative and important what the Community Connections team is doing, and what your team is doing. Director Liu, can we turn it over to you for your reactions and comments? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Unfortunately, yeah, Director Liu, we cannot hear you. So I wonder. I am going to. Yeah. Okay, so what we're going to do is she's probably going to log off and log back on. I wonder, we did have kind of a comment come up, and so I wonder, Director Waters and anybody else who might want to chime in on this. I've often thought the same very question too, thinking about how, I've wondered why we don't have more social workers sort of responding to these social, issues around mental health, substance use, suicide, homelessness, with the support, of course, of police and law enforcement. And this comment sort of brings up a very good point. Domestic violence is one of the most likely situations for an officer to be killed. And this person worries that the solution of substituting social workers for police officers may result in more social workers being killed. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, and then we can turn it back to Director Liu to see if things are working with the technology.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's something that's very close to my heart. I would never want to go to a call without an officer, if I'm being completely honest, especially domestic violence calls. Those calls we usually don't respond to because of the fact that they tend to be the most lethal. And so it is tricky to figure out which calls are best to go to. But my team personally, we don't ever want to respond to calls without officers because most of the calls we respond to are so unpredictable. With substance use and mental health, you don't really know which way it's going to go. Even if there's a clear, explanation of the call, things can go one direction very fast. And so I've enjoyed going out with officers, and it's been interesting. A lot of people have asked, do we get a lot of pushback because there's officers with the social worker? And there hasn't been nearly as much pushback as I expected there to be. Especially like coming from working in the jail, I felt like it was more challenging just as me as a social worker therapist talking to people. But with the officers, a lot of the officers are familiar and more personalized with these individuals. They've known them for years, worked with them for years, that they bring a lot of information. So yeah, to that point, I would also fear if social workers were sent out without officers. I feel the officer is still needed, and we can still work out ways if an officer even steps aside and they're not necessarily right there, but that we can still be flexible of seeing like, hey, you stand over there, I'll be here, or we're both here on scene, everyone feels safe that way. But yeah, I would fear being sent out without an officer.
And can I just briefly comment on that? And that's, we're about to implement this. We're going to take the fall to develop, and then with plans to implement in the spring. In our research, that's one of the questions that we've seen of, it varies, right? There are other places like Portland, Oregon's been doing this for a bit. Denver, Houston, there are some other cities nationally that have done it. And you see sort of a mixed approach in regards to, is it social workers alone? But the comments that Jessica made it's that even the social workers would like to have some sort of comfort and support in having an officer there. And in early discussions, it's been that sometimes the officers are dressed and maybe not in a traditional police uniform.
Sure.
To be present, because sometimes the uniform incites it, just the presence.
Yeah.
With that. And so there are options, and those are things that I know that's a part of the discussions nationally is how do we do it to still have everyone safe, but at the same time knowing just merely by the presence of a uniform what that can do to people in certain circumstances. So very good point.
Absolutely, and it brings up, of course, a whole host of questions that I certainly have that we can get to about what the uniform means and what the badge means, and making sure that our law enforcement really do understand when we go into communities of color, for instance, Latino and Latina communities, what that means in terms of even reporting anything to the police because of potential undocumented citizens or undocumented individuals. Director Liu, I'm hoping we can hear from you. Darn it, we still can't hear. Yeah. Are we at a loss to know? Okay. Maybe she can call in. Or check the Bluetooth, I'm thinking. you might also, just FYI, have Emily Breen's email, and you might be able to problem solve offline. I'm really sorry to hear that. We'd like to get your perspective, but while they are trying to work on some of the technology issues, maybe I think it's important to maybe think about some of the questions too that have kind of bubbled up a little bit in the conversation. And one thing I'd like to just maybe get your take on from each of the panelists is, police officers have a very, very difficult, it goes without saying, a very difficult profession and a very difficult career that is not one that is, a 9 to 5. It's not one you ever leave. I personally work quite a bit with correctional officers, and which is a different form of law enforcement. And I just think it's incredibly important to make sure that we are in partnership consistently with law enforcement and understanding what these issues really mean for them, and not just for citizens and people of color, who, of course, there are plenty of people of color, of course, who serve in law enforcement. But just like, police officers, or just like you and me, are embedded in a culture of control. I do feel like in this country, in the last, particularly in criminal justice, in the last 50 years, we have really made a decision, a political and strategic and policy decisions, to mass incarcerate, to police very differently. And we are in this culture of sort of what we call in my world, the penal harm movement and the carceral state. And we know that formal social control mechanisms, such as policing and corrections, serve, of course, a very vital and important role. But we can't really punish our way any longer into systematic crime control. I feel like if we could, we would know better. And even though we've got the lowest crime rate we've seen in a generation, the research around mass incarceration is certainly that it has very, very limited effects in terms of producing individual changes in behavior. And so I wonder if you would comment on, what systematic cultural interventions you feel like are really needed around these issues. And in particular, I know that many agencies, of course, are kind of pulling the lever on initial training and making sure that we have, our officers trained on implicit and unconscious bias, and hiring more people of color. And, the strategies that obviously are a very, very important start, but in my opinion, don't seem to go far enough in terms of deeply thinking about these issues and the cultural meaning of what it does mean to have the badge and to go into different communities of color. I wonder if we could just get your take on what you think about that, because training in those areas, in my opinion, and what the research is starting to say, is just simply not enough.
Yeah, I can start
Oh, I think Dr. Cobbina maybe was going to chime in.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I completely agree though about the need, the need for, police officers to understand, again, the history, like what the badge represents. Because, I know, like I just talked about the whole history, from the very foundation of this country, there's been a tenuous relationship between Black people and the police. And I understand sometimes, officers, and I get it, will say, I wasn't around back then. I had nothing to do with that. But just, it is important to understand the history, because even as we, with protesting and stuff, like, yes, people are protesting the incident, but it is so much more than the George Floyd incident and the incident of other Black and brown people, right? It is really this legacy of racial injustice. I will say, because I know training keeps coming up, and, as you mentioned, Dr. Salisbury, we've been trained, officers have been trained, right? They've been receiving training. Like, this is not like officers have never received training and now it's like, well, let's go to training. Anytime incidents like these happen, we pull at the importance of, diversifying the police force, training officers, and certainly a need for all of that. But police departments, and again, they do vary. There's like 18,000 police departments. They vary, but the reality is police officers have been receiving implicit bias training, cultural sensitivity training, de-escalation training. Of course, that varies. but yet we continue to see Black and brown people dying at the hands of the police. About 1,000 men, women, and children are killed each year by the police. Many more are abused and by the police. And so I always get a little leery with training, although I certainly understand the need, particularly for greater emphasis like on de-escalation training. I think if we are going to train officers, I would argue for the need to train them really in restorative practices. I would argue for a need to create a space in which police officers and community members who have had problems with the police come together, in which both parties are discuss the incident. They discuss what happened, the effect that it's had on both of them, and then together what needs to happen in order to repair the harm. This is moderated then by a competent facilitator. This is really the hallmark of restorative practices, and research on this process has shown that it does have remarkable effects in allowing everyone to really gain a shared understanding on the situation and what needs to happen in order to repair the harm. And so as a result, there is, in general, much research that shows that there is strong satisfaction and feelings of fairness from among all those who participate in the restorative process. And so I would argue that if we are going to do any more training, that restorative practices can provide a path forward towards building relationships, repairing harm, and invoking real change within the criminal legal system.
Yeah, and it's the complexities to this. It's not one particular thing either, right? And so if you look at the panel, we're all from different fields within the profession. And I'm sure, if you gave each of us, 30 minutes to write a list just in our areas of what we're going to work on or what's needed, the list is going to be expansive with it. And that's part of the complexity, is that it's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be 10 things that changes this. Again, this is not something that occurred overnight either. So it will take the time and the commitment with it. I've been asked what's different about this series of protests and demonstration than, you can almost point to, a killing annually at a minimum to say, there are different protests and things like that. The difference in this is that it actually appears as though society has said enough with it, and that there's support beyond just the underrepresented communities as well with this. And, I just sort of I revert back to the basics of, laws are based on social norms, right? So who establishes those social norms? The people do with that. And when you talk about some of the incarceration rates and, some of the prosecution and things, you look at some of the, the war on drugs when I first started in the early 90s with that, and how the laws were written, and the punishments and the mandatories that went along with crack cocaine were completely different than those with pure cocaine. Who uses what? Whose impact on what communities are going to be more reflective of that? And there are a lot of different things in play that are going to have to take place for it to really start to see a shift. And we talk about, officers are trained. That's what the academy is. It's training. There's in-service training as well. You get the culture as well. So what's the culture in the departments, and what the relationships with the communities are all going to impact that. And, it's your experiences, as a kid, and what your experiences are with the police. I easily recall being in uniform at a restaurant and, a parent come up and say, hey, if you don't listen to me, this officer's going to take you to jail. And I've been down and tell the kid, no, I'm not. This officer is going to talk to you about what actually has occurred, and we're going to see what's the best way to go about this. And so just those little things in regards to biases, we all have them. It's the recognition of those biases and how we utilize them and how we address them that goes about it. And how are you going to be held accountable for those actions that go along with it as well?
Absolutely. I would like to see if we can get Director Liu. I think she's tried to call in. Are you there, Director Liu?
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Are.
Okay. Well, thank you for including me in this conversation despite my myriad technical issues. So I really appreciated reading Dr. Kobina's scholarship and hearing her remarks. what really struck me is that in policymaking, we don't often routinely consider the voices of individuals or communities most impacted by policing. And so I really appreciate Dr. Kobina's elevating of those voices and reminding us that if we want different outcomes, we're going to need more equitable conversations that is going to need to regularly bring in the broader perspectives and experiences that we see reflected in her work. So I'm the director of the Salt Lake County Office of Criminal Justice Initiatives. And in that role, I also am the director of our Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. And so I wanted, with my remarks, just to broaden the frame a little bit to the behavior of the criminal justice system as a whole. This conversation about policing is so important, but it also reflects the larger systemic behavior of the entire system. And this moment, has not, I hope it's a unique moment, but it hasn't revealed necessarily truths about racial inequalities that we didn't already know. So those of us who've been working on criminal justice work in Utah, folks have been working very, very hard at criminal justice reform. So for on the adult side, starting in 2015, on the juvenile side, starting in 2017. The goal was to have a less punitive system with more options to divert cases, identifying folks who can be safely supported in the community rather than in jail, or in the case of youth, placements outside of the home. And part of the goal was to reduce disparities that we saw. And we've done a lot of good. The overall size and reach of our punitive systems in favor of more evidence-based practices, we have seen some good outcomes. What we have also seen is that justice reform has dramatically worsened racial disparities. In 2017, 43% of all individuals sentenced to Utah prison were racial or ethnic minorities. So, I think the question is, when we talk about when do we use the criminal justice system, when do we use punishment, when do we reach for that as opposed to a different tool? We see a racialized dimension to this. Our system seems to behave differently depending on the population affected. When we think about, each of our experiences, whether you're a social worker or you're an attorney, or whatever role you have in the criminal justice system, when we're inside of a courtroom and we are watching an individual case, to whom do we afford diversionary opportunities? For whom is there a strength-based narrative, a serious, nuanced conversation about alternatives? Who do we decide needs to be controlled and punished, and who really, has something, quote unquote, something else going on? And so I think that these are really important questions. And now that, a lot of good effort and good intention has gone into justice reform, this is the challenge that we need to take on. With respect to what's happening in Salt Lake County, so I think it's very clear that the county needs to build, and the mayor has identified and has put a lot of thought and effort into the idea that we need to create a robust bilateral framework for community voices to be permanently part of the discussion with respect to policy. This conversation has been a lot about racial bias. There's another very important bias, and that's institutional bias, right? We do tend to, think about things from the lens of, our particular roles. We do tend to reach for the tools that we have. When I was a public defender, I thought, zealous representation was the key. When I was a legal educator, I thought legal education was the key. Now that I oversee 2 data analysts, I tend to reach for the tools of, dashboarding and data and analysis. And I think we need to recognize that. And I think by bringing in community voices who can speak to what exactly is happening on the ground, not what we think is happening on the ground, but how do people actually experience all the work that we're trying to do, that needs to inform the work that we're trying to do. I think the county also has a huge role to play with respect to transparency in process and performance. My office worked collaboratively with the Salt Lake County Jail to build the jail dashboard, which is one of the most transparent in the country. It provides real-time data about what is happening in our jails. There needs to be a lot more of that. Folks should be able to see exactly what is the process and how are we doing at each stage of the process in the criminal justice system. And we need to redefine those performance metrics. You know, what does true community safety look like? Have we even defined what those metrics would be? How do we hold ourselves accountable for those reimagined metrics that, you know, is not about, you know, protecting one community against another, but imagine safety for everybody in our community. And I think it's also expanding on a lot of good work that Salt Lake County has already done. There's a lot of interdisciplinary work that happens here. So we have an extraordinary Department of Behavioral Health that has worked for years in collaboration with the criminal justice system. But unfortunately, a lot of these efforts that are evidence-based, that are working, they tend to exist at the margins. The total number of people that we're serving in things like, you know, the intense supervision project at CJS, through our drug courts, through our multidisciplinary teams of social workers at UPD, these don't touch, you know, nearly the numbers that we would need to, I think, in order to see the kind of results that we want to see. So those are just some thoughts about how I see the challenge before us and some of the things that we hope to be working on at Salt Lake County.
Director Liu, I'm so happy we got you back. Given everything that you've just mentioned, you know, I just think you've raised many important points, particularly around the issue of, you know, what is safe. What I consider safety may not be something that another person, particularly a person of color coming from a poor community potentially, would feel as safe. And I think thinking about perceptions of safety and reimagining, as you said, some of the metrics around the transparency and allowing data to get to the hands of the people and allowing people on the ground to be able to have a voice, which is a movement that I'm seeing across different aspects of not just in criminal justice and policing and corrections, but of course in education and other areas as well. That if we don't have the people who are most affected at the table, and certainly in a group of people, not just one or two people, then we're not really getting at the most important solutions that I think will be as long lasting as they potentially could be. And it brings me also to this idea that I really just wanted to make sure to kind of get out there, is this idea that, you know, police agencies and counties and governments are really trying hard to implement quickly some reforms. And the point that you make, Director Liu, around, you know, sometimes reforms can backfire. And we don't oftentimes have all of the answers in terms of what should be put in place. Police agencies and departments are put in a very difficult position, in my opinion, right now, because there actually is very little evidence and research around some of the effectiveness of the basic things that we go to around implicit bias and unconscious training. Like, it is entirely possible that implementing implicit unconscious bias training with police officers could backfire, could actually root people into their positions and their biases further if it's not done well. And if we're not careful about these things and thinking about the evidence base and considering what is already out there and what isn't, you know, police departments, unfortunately, are at a loss oftentimes to think about how to implement these distinctions and these reforms. And so, you know, I see it as our role at the Utah Criminal Justice Center to be a part of that conversation and thinking about locally, you know, what is the evidence out there specifically on things like de-escalation training. And the unfortunate reality is some of the most recent evidence suggests that it can change police officer attitudes, but not necessarily behavior. And changing behavior is really difficult. I'm in the business of helping correctional departments try to change justice-involved people's behavior. And just as it's difficult to change offender behavior, it's very difficult to change staff behavior as well, especially when they're rooted in these sorts of ideas in terms of what they've been doing in the past. And they only know what they know. So, I wonder again, everybody's take on that issue and the fact that there actually isn't a whole lot of evidence to suggest yet the effectiveness in terms of rigorous evidence and randomized controlled trials on this work. And it's coming, but it isn't there yet.
The one thing I just want to talk about, as I know there's often a lot of, like I mentioned, a lot of talk on implicit bias training. I do want to say that, when we say implicit bias training, that would, really suggest that a person's actions are unconscious. But we know, for instance, that what happened to George Floyd and what has happened to so many others is really, it was not unconscious, it was conscious. What we saw is conscious, violent racism that essentially is practiced, it's learned, and it's then passed down. So I guess, like, for me, implicit bias training is not really the answer, because we're actually seeing state violence, explicit violence that no implicit bias training is going to get at. So I think it's important that we broaden our conversation. And I think it is why we see so many racial justice organizations really pushing for really this new shared vision of what safety looks like, as Director Liu mentioned, right? Which is why we see such a huge call to, again, divest from the police, so that there is less reliance on, we're not heavily relying on the police, and rather we are attempting to strengthen agencies and human-centered services that help to stabilize communities, that would result in less reliance on the police in the first place. And this can be done, for instance, by just even divesting from the police, having police in schools, and instead investing in teachers and counselors, divesting from criminalizing mental health, and instead investing in mental health clinicians and restorative practices, divesting from having military weapons used against civilians, and instead investing in some of these harm reduction programs. And the reality is, we now see that cities across the nation are rethinking their municipal budget because of COVID-19. And so I actually see this as a unique opportunity. Yes, these are hard issues seeped in, 400 years of a history, a legacy of racial injustice, but this is also an opportunity where we can look at how we can shift our priorities from law enforcement, which is what we've all known, into trying to investing in a shared vision, vision of community safety and infrastructure that really will result, in safety for all of us.
Yeah, and I think that, and so things are transitional. So if we think about why police are even in the schools, we could start with Columbine, right? And so you think about the violence that has taken place in the schools, and sort of the group think was, well, let's place police officers who can deal with this, who could sort of address this initially, as opposed to call the police for assistance in that. We would already have police on site that could handle it with that. It's transitional. It went, again, I'm a former DARE officer, drug abuse resistance education, taught fifth graders, DARE in the school systems. That transition from having an educational program to having an armed police officer performing police functions in the schools with that. And so it's some of that is consequential of what sort of maybe society wanted at the time. And now, so we go back and we undo it. Things are cyclical in that manner. And so I think we're not minimizing what has occurred. This isn't new, the excessive use of force and things of that nature. But if we look at some of the responsibilities that have been placed on police over time, it is generally due to certain incidents occurring. And again, oh, well, that's okay. Well, then we can put that with the police. So I do agree that we have to rethink the function and how police are utilized with it. when we start talking about the defunding piece, I think we have to use caution in regards to not deplete it, because there's going to be a need for those services. Yes, can we reallocate some of that? I think in most cases, if you were to talk to law enforcement nationally, some of these departments who have these additional responsibilities, I think they would agree that they would be more than happy to have, social workers or those who are better prepared to perform those types of functions. But it becomes, when it almost gets to a point of the discussion is now you're completely depleting, the services that may actually be needed with that. And there's the other side of that when we talk about the community engagement and the accountability of the community. There are a lot of other things going on that don't necessarily involve where the police are actually the ones that on the wrong end of it. And so those other resources, as we would argue and hope that if we replenish some of those community services, that then would lead to a safer community overall with that. So I don't really think when in the discussions that I've had with police nationally is the concern is not necessarily redirecting or reallocating. Some of the talk, when you talk defund and abolish, that's a completely different conversation.
But defunding really does mean to reinvest, right? To reallocate resources.
Reallocate, yes.
That's really how it's defined. And it's not about depleting the police budget to zero, but reallocating. Because certainly, there's always a concern, what we don't want is for, there's always concern, well, won't crime increase, won't lawlessness take place, and what the communities, the residents most in need ultimately are now faced with lawlessness and under protection, right? We don't want that as well. And so it really is about, it's really about trying to find this middle ground where policing can be done much more effectively, and also by holding officers much more accountable than they are, but at the same time reducing the need for such heavy reliance on law enforcement.
Yeah, or what you get now is what we see, crime rates, violence has increased in some of the cities, right? If you look at Baltimore, Chicago, the activity levels of police are maybe not as high as they were prior to some of the protests and demonstrations. You hear different reasons why. Well, we have officers assigned to these protests and demonstrations, things like that. New policies being implemented, there's uncertainty, or sometimes the mentality is, I'm not quite sure what I can do. And and you get that overall impact. So interesting times with it.
Yeah, and it brings up an important point too that one of our participants has asked too. It brings up this idea of the so-called Ferguson Effect, too, in terms of thinking about what's happened with the protests and with the Black Lives Matter movement being even more mobilized and bringing more and more individuals into understanding and protesting and being actively engaged. And, I just wonder, based on what I've seen in terms of the research, particularly, just so I guess I should explain the Ferguson Effect, there's some, it's an important question, one that is critical to thinking about the evidence base in these issues, whether or not law enforcement is taking sort of a less active role in going after calls for service, or not quite approaching proactively areas of problems that they may not, that otherwise they would have, particularly in communities of color. And so, there's been quite some research being investigated on this issue. And from what I've seen, based on work from Richard Rosenfeld, is that there's not a lot of evidence. Of course, it depends on how you sort of measure the arrest rates and the homicide violence that's happening as a result of this, but there doesn't seem to be much of an effect in terms of that going on. But, I'd be curious to see what you all are seeing and reading as well.
So, Rick Rosenfeld, he did his study in 2015 where he does argue that he concludes that there was no Ferguson effect for homicide. Another study was done by David Peru, Scott Decker, and my colleague Scott Wolf, where they also examined criminal data for 12 months before the Ferguson incident and 12 months after the Ferguson incident. And they looked at 81 cities in the US, and they found no support. They found no evidence to support a systematic post-Ferguson change in overall violence and property trends. However, they did find that robbery rates had declined before the Ferguson incident, but it did start to increase in the months after the Ferguson incident. And with that exception, other than that, they did conclude overall that there was no Ferguson effect in overall violent and property trends.
That's what I'm seeing as well. And, you know, there may be some newer research emerging and coming out, certainly around this issue. And honestly, it's one of those questions that needs to be addressed and considered and thought about carefully and empirically. We've got about 10 minutes left, and so I just wonder if maybe we can try to tackle a few of these questions. One of them I'm seeing specifically for Chief Lynch, this idea of the us against them mentality with being on the police force. This person has several friends in law enforcement, and they say that they see no color as officers of the law and that they are all blue. So what's maybe your take on this idea of you know, moving into law enforcement as somebody who wanted to help communities, but you know, the difficulties and challenges around eradicating the mindset of us versus them and us against them?
Yeah, it is. I think someone mentioned earlier about how, you know, you go into a police department, whether you're sworn or non-sworn, it tends to be a family environment. And a lot of it is sort of, you know, is based on the fact that you go through everything together. It's a lot. It's an emotional job. You're seen at your worst. You're seen at your best. You rely heavily on that support that you get, and it's different than working in corporate America from that perspective. Now, having said that, though, you know, some of the mentality changes. You know, it's you know, I hear a lot about the warrior mentality, and now, you know, you're asking me to be a guardian and things like that. Well, I've always viewed it from that perspective, you know, with that, but that in a sense, it was like that. And the us against them, it's an interesting dynamic because one, you know, it is, you are dressed in a uniform and you are set apart from the community by the uniform. With that, the us comes into play by the family driven component with it. But the versus piece that's the problem that I have issue with, because I don't think it's a versus or against. It's the role is you're being part of and you represent the community with that. And some, you know, the mentality of it is extremely interesting. Some of the studies that I've read in regards to that and the personalities that come into it. But then again, the various dynamics, you know, it's then what team am I on, right? if it's the us against them, who is them? Is it everyone wearing the uniform, or am I being treated like everyone else that's in the uniform? I'm going to say in my 27 years, not no, but hell no, right? So that's not the case with it. So there's even divisions within it. But I think in most cases, the us against them was a lot more along with, you know, the police against the criminals. I think that's the initial intent with it. And it has evolved over time into other things with it. So yes, it does exist. I think it exists at different levels depending upon the culture of the different departments. That drives a lot of it. It really does. The individual cultures of the department you will see the product and how the officers perform and engage with the communities based on what the culture is.
Yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with leadership. I think it has a lot to do with, you know, the individuals at the top and modeling what they want their agency, you know, no matter whether we're talking about policing or anything else, you know, in terms of the kind of culture that spills down from the kind of leadership that we, you know, put in place. It's related to another question that was posted in terms of course, this idea of, you know, police officers going through incredible amounts of trauma every day. the difficult job that they create. But how can we create a space where officers feel safe and brace to self-correct, and to create a space where they can share some of the challenges and concerns that they might have about other police officers? I mean, it's starting to come out that quite a few officers certainly were concerned about Officer Chauvin's behavior prior to, the event with George Floyd and his death. What is it going to take to start moving in that direction and helping officers feel safe enough, to go against that blue line? It's hard to know, right? It's hard to know.
Just something that I kind of thought of is a matter of trust on both ends, matter of trust, loss of trust with community members, but then also trust within law enforcement, not feeling like they can be trusted, and who do they go to? And I think that falls within that fact that officers don't have that time to do community policing of, let me get to know this restaurant owner here, let me get to know this community member who lives in this neighborhood. Let's see you as a person as well, have that time to see each other as individuals and not the badge versus a community member or the verse at all. But I think a matter of trust, somehow there needs to be more trust built. I mean, obviously, like with the community and police, but also I think with officers, the fear of not being trusted as well, of do I share anything if I'm going to immediately be seen as this or that? And that's a fear of, like, who do I go to where I'm not going to be spun up or like it's going to be shown or advertised everywhere. So I think trust on both ends is a big factor.
Trust seems to be a critical feature, right? And thinking about too, I think, a program that I used to be involved with in Las Vegas, Hope for Prisoners, really does model this idea of bringing law enforcement in with people who are formerly and currently justice involved, and they come in without the uniform, and they come in telling their stories about some of the things that they've experienced. And there's plenty of police officers and people in law enforcement who've experienced, people ending up in the justice system, and having their stories being told, and then sort of revealing to the justice involved individuals that they are actually the police and law enforcement. And so creating those communities and levels of trust really, really is critically important. But that doesn't happen without concerted effort. It doesn't happen without law enforcement agencies, in my opinion, based off the work of people like David Kennedy at John Jay. It's this idea that there has to be kind of a communication and a dialogue and a recognition that even though police departments and agencies haven't necessarily tried to be racist or have racist policies, that sort of saying, we're sorry, this is not what we intended. This is not what we intended. And we need to have a community dialogue with faith leaders, with people in the community from all different walks of life to sort of say, what can we do better? And to have that kind of local recognition. Yes, this is a national problem, but these are local issues that have to be addressed. And it's not just, police legitimacy and erosion of trust of the police. It's something that's fundamentally happening, across multiple social institutions, around erosion of the media, trust in the media, trust in government. And I think we are in a window of opportunity, as Dr. Kobina has mentioned, around trying to really hone in best ways that we know how, of trying to improve that trust and improve the legitimacy of our social institutions, because people are desperate for it and people are dying because of it.
Yeah, I definitely completely agree about it's necessary for there to be, first a reckoning, I think among, police chiefs, along with mayors of each city, again, to own up to the real harm that's been committed at the hands of the police in the past and the present, and also acknowledging how various ways in which traditional policing has been damaging to communities of color. And as you mentioned, David Kennedy, his work on police community reconciliation framework tries really tries to get at that. I think there has to be first an acknowledgement there, but then also creating spaces in which, again, you have both sides hearing and listening to one another about, the job of police, about community members talking about the experiences that they've had and why both sides feel the way they do. Doing that in and of itself helps to humanize the other side. Part of when we see crime, we know crime is symptomatic of broader societal problems, but it's also an issue too of a breakdown in relationships. And this is kind of one thing that we can also attempt to do, leaning into this discomfort by creating a space and having this conversations we don't really want to have, but we're going to create this space, this brave space where we can both listen to one another. And of course, it needs to be facilitated so that it's not just a yelling fest, but an opportunity for both sides to hear one another. I think that goes a long way in humanizing people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've reached our time, and I just wanted to allow anybody else who wanted to comment to go ahead and comment. And if there aren't comments, I can close us out. No? Okay, perfect. Well, I sincerely want to thank our speakers for planting some seeds of solutions and to really creating a dialogue that I feel like it just is incredibly important to model for our community. And to our audience, I want to thank you for daring to care. We hope that we've inspired you in some small way to turn your caring into action. And for those of you that were asking about ways to volunteer, I would ask that the speakers maybe email me and discuss in terms of thinking about ways that our community can turn that caring into action. We'll hope that you'll join us for our next Dare to Care event on Tuesday, August 4th, when we focus on the criminalization and adultification of Black girls in school and its relationship to the school to trauma and prison pipelines. Thank you so much for your time, and we very much appreciate your participation and engagement. Thank you.